Hello? All right.
Is it on?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, I think, one of the most interesting and probably most important panels of the whole COP. Now, everyone says that, but I've got a panel that has to now produce on that. So my name is Michael Sharon. I'm working with the UNDP. Those of you that are in the climate space may know me from the Bank of England. I spent 10 years there working with Mark Carney. I was the co-chairman of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group with Dr. Ma Jun for almost 5 years. And before going into the world of policy, I spent over 25 years in the debt capital markets in New York and London. So I've got a practitioner view of the people who filled out this important benchmark. But more importantly, I've had over 10 years deep in the policy realm about how important it is to transition to a sustainable real economy. And again, what we're going to try to do today is not just tell you about the report, and in a moment, Andrea's going to come up and give you the headlines because we don't want to bury those. But more importantly, we want to know how this benchmark can be actioned upon, why it's important, and trust me, they're going to deliver on this, and what our next steps can be on this. So as I said to Andrea when we first talked, everyone here, both online who's watching us and all of you here in the audience, you don't want to have your headlines buried. You want to know this benchmark, who was benchmarked, what were the key outcomes of it, why they're important, so then you know when we start talking as a group, and this very distinguished and very informed panel can actually start getting into unpacking and getting very granular. And that's what we want to do on this. And also, we're going to welcome questions from all of you at the end, because we couldn't pick a more informed audience sitting here at COP. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce Andrea Webster, who is basically the driving force and the face of this benchmark, to tell you a little bit about what was achieved, what the outcomes were, and that will begin our presentation for today. So Andrea, please.
Michael, thank you very much. If I could correct you there, Michael, I might be the face of this, but I'm not the driving force behind it. There is an amazing team at World Benchmarking Alliance who I really want to acknowledge at this moment. We talk about acronyms a lot at COP. I've heard so many today that I've never heard of, and I'm going to throw another one in, a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal that the World Benchmarking Alliance had 2 years ago with the concept of benchmarking the financial system. And BHAGs are supposed to be impossible, and we're here to show that it is possible, and I want this conversation today to be about the art of what is possible. I want to start off and just, so it's going to work. Oh, hang on. Hi, thank you. For those that aren't familiar with the World Benchmarking Alliance, I just want to set some context that we are assessing 2,000 of the world's largest and most influential companies and institutions who can directly or indirectly influence the Sustainable Development Goals. These 2,000 companies employ over 100 million people, and their total revenue accounts for approximately a third of global GDP. Our raison d'etre is transparency and disclosure, so we can recognize and hold account the private sector to its responsibilities and its, the expectations of it. I do also want to accept that this is collaborative, and I'm grateful for those that are joining this, this discussion. I also want to mention that we're not for profit. We're here for the public good, and that's what distinguishes from a lot of the benchmarking that happens already within the finance system. Oh, wrong way. So 400 influential financial institutions in this benchmark are banks, asset owners, asset managers, and insurers. And within that, we've got pension funds, both private and public and state. We have sovereign wealth funds, we have the development banks, and the investment consultants. So this is a considerable goal, but the importance is recognizing the interconnection between all these different players in the finance system, and recognizing that for us to mainstream sustainable finance, we need alignment, and therefore this is why they're all in this benchmark. In terms of the continents, you can all look this up on our website, but in terms of continents, the largest is the US, and then it's Asia, followed by Europe. But we've tried to go for global coverage, and those smaller institutions relative to the larger players are there because of their influence and their dominance within their region. Now, we take a neutral position, and we don't want to set new standards. We look for what is already out there. It is a very noisy space. This is just a section of what we drew on to create this methodology. I think in total to create it, we pulled from just under 100 different standards. So this visually shows the size of the challenge. We're aspirational with this benchmark, and our objective is to be a guiding North Star with the direction of travel, to get the attention and to create a comfortable space for all the stakeholders of finance to come together. I do urge you to look at the methodology. I'm not going to dive into it in detail, but we want to be globally relevant, and therefore we're broad in our methodology. The strongest focus is on governance and strategy, which carries a 40% weighting. Governance is obviously within the DNA of the finance system, but also it creates a culture and it sets a top-down tone and the direction of travel for the rest of the organization and across into these other areas. Respecting planetary boundaries covers both climate and nature and biodiversity, and societal conventions is human rights as well as social issues. So I do urge you to dig in online and have a look. Now, in terms of the process, there was no opt-out in this. Companies, whether they chose to or not, we were going to assess them. We looked at publicly available information and annual reports and sustainability reports. Our assessments were sent to all the financial institutions in May this year, so there was a line in the sand that was drawn, and they did have an opportunity to review and come back to us. I'm grateful to the 25% of those that did reply. Now, the scoring for this is out of 100. Now, I'm going to be clear, I've worked in finance for 20 years, and I'm proud of that. Many of my friends and my peers work in finance, so looking at these results hurt. When you look at this, we're scoring out of 100, and I do congratulate those that score well in this benchmark, but we do need to step back and recognize that overall it is poor. Nearly 300 institutions scored 20 or under. I think just sort of the enormity of that is really important in the conversation that we have after this. One of my colleagues mentioned to me that to score well in this benchmark, you only needed to be average. There are only 3 people in this benchmark that scored over 50. And again, just as we talk about the rankings, I think we need to look beyond that as a sector and see, okay, where do we go from here? Now, I think it's also important to contextualize the results given the different range of organizations that are in here and also the regional nuance. So I urge you all to dig in on the website and filter and look, but I'm going to talk through 5 of the key findings that really struck me and the team, and I think is an important basis for the discussion. Actually, I want to touch on regional observations here as well. We touched on governance, and I think one of what's noticeable in this is that the system does well where it plays to its strengths, where its natural DNA is, and that's in governance. I think obviously there's a regulatory influence there as well, but the highest scoring area across all regions was governance. It is, I think, worth drawing out the difference between planetary boundaries and the social issues across the regions, and the subtlety in who scores better in those 2 measurement areas. And I think that very much reflects the different regional priorities. And when we sit here in COP and we talk about an energy transition, I think it's really important that the conversation carries on moving towards the just transition and the importance that those social issues get picked up. I know everybody knows the issues of what's happening in North America, and in particular the US. To my colleague from, my gentleman from Canada, Canada scores well, but it is very noticeable how far behind North America is within this benchmark. But I would say that there are positive bright spots. There are some outliers in there in countries and regions that you wouldn't expect. So please don't go and dig in, especially there's some wonderful surprises in the top 10. Starting at governance, when we talk about identifying impact, and this is beyond risk management, this is both identifying negative and positive impact. Less than 20% of the institutions met our baseline indicator on publicly acknowledging their impact. And I think that as a starting point paints an important picture. We can't move forward in identifying, managing, putting processes in place and moving forward if those impacts aren't identified. Targets have been a very strong subject of conversation coming into COP, and for good reason. This was drawn a line in the sand in May, so I recognise that it's a rapidly evolving backdrop, but less than 40% of the institutions in this benchmark had commitments to net zero. And within those commitments, only 2% had set interim targets, and only 1% were science evidence backed. So I think there is a lot of discussion that's going out. There's a lot of frustration and anger, and when we look at these results, it's rightly so. Human rights, risk and impact, this measurement area, I've pulled one particular point out of here, but disclosure on social issues is almost non-existent other than baseline and regulatory reporting. I think I want to draw this point as well because there's a lot of discussion at the moment on human rights due diligence regulation, and if the industry doesn't get there on its own, then that justifies the need for regulation, and that's the conversation probably beyond today, but I think it's a point that justifies why policymakers have this on their radar. Inclusive finance. I've heard this SMEs is something that's close to my heart, and I've heard this come up in all the discussions at high level this week, and also in some of the booths and the pavilions around here about the need that make sure that SMEs don't become unintended consequences of the transition. And to do that, we need to understand where the flow of money is going. So we need disclosure on those assets, and you see here it's very low. So 2% disclosure to low-income countries, 14% to excluded groups, which includes women, and only 23% to SMEs. So we need to have those disclosure levels higher so that the solutions and making sure that those capital flows are taking place, we can see what's happening. And then nature and biodiversity, I do recognise that it is a relatively new measurement area. Obviously, there's a lot of work happening with TNFD, and there's momentum that's been gathering. But if we look at just the number of institutions that have identified their impact on nature and biodiversity, it's less than 5%. And when you put that in the context that 50% of world's GDP is linked to nature, I think the finance system really does need to recognise that there's a beyond risk, there's a systemic risk issue, and it really ought to be pushed up the agenda, getting ready for what's coming with the processes that are being worked on at the moment. Now, that paints a woeful and a bleak picture. But what I do want to say is that in the process of building this benchmark, we've also seen a lot in terms of what is possible. We can see within that benchmark, within the findings that we dig in, those outliers that are finding ways to operationalize this. So the point of this benchmark here, we're looking to mainstream sustainable finance, move the dial, and how do we turn the results and the richness of the findings that are within this into action?
That was, thank you. That was fantastic. And before we get to our very, very esteemed group of panelists, and I've seen Marc Andre's been taking very good notes, so we're expecting great answers from him, diligently following it down. Before we talk to our panelists, you've lived this, you've been a big part of it. the big question is, how do you think this could be actionable? Because it's a great piece of work. It's global. At the BOE, we did stuff within the City of London. I've seen other bits and pieces. This is the first time I've ever seen a global snapshot across not just one area, not just banking, asset managers, sovereign wealth funds. By the way, Gert, you're going to have to bear the brunt of every single institution there, because you're so be ready. So the big question is, what happens? What action comes from this? What are you looking for as the outcome of this information? Because there's not been anything quite like this, and as you said, you're disappointed. It's tough. What can people take away, and what can they hope this will drive action on?
That's a big question, and for me, this is just the starting point. There are a huge amount of people that have busted a gut to deliver this benchmark, and I am really proud and in awe of them. But this is just the beginning. It's the movement that comes out of this. We're part of an alliance, and we have 350 institutions that use our data. So I want people to take the data and use it, take the methodology, look at their own assessments. Each institution in this benchmark has a report that shows how we think they're doing relative to the methodology, relative to their peers. Take it, read it, look at your peers, and look what's happening across the system as well, that alignment piece. I talk about the domino effect. We have asset owners and asset managers in here. The alignment piece. My hope is that this is the starting point to action of conversations, but also identifying who's actually moving the dial and aligning and following them.
No, that's really helpful and really insightful. And I can tell you, as a former regulator, when our institutions, one of the best ways to get them to act is tell them they're subperforming against their peers. It's literally like going into the playground again. And if Billy Bank isn't doing as well as Bobby Bank, Billy gets really upset. I'm dead serious. We anonymize it, but we'll tell them, oh, by the way, you think you're really great on credit analysis? Well, guess what? Your non-performing loans are much higher than the other one. And that really gets their attention. So just from that point of view, having something that's global, where asset managers, where banks can all look at that, I think just right off the bat, they can start looking at how are we stacking up against the others, and hopefully that's something. And additionally, as policymakers, I would imagine, Marc-Andre, you talk more of this, you've been in so many different places, regulation and legislation are big drivers as well in both the real economy as well as in that. And I think this is a type of benchmark that would inspire policymakers as well. And hopefully those are things that can really be actionable. But now what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn to each of our three very, very distinguished panelists, give you a little bit about who they are and why they're here, and more importantly, a little bit of contextualness about why they care about in their particular role about this benchmark. Now, as I said, Gert, I'm going to start with you. You're right there. You're representing a financial institution, and you're the only one here who's kind of doing that, so you're bearing the brunt of all of them. But give us a little bit about your background, why you're here, and why this is important to you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Well, listening to you, it wasn't a full knockout, but it was a knockdown. And I'm talking from the perspective of a Dutch pension money asset manager. We're somewhere between asset owner and asset manager. And I must admit that until today, or maybe yesterday when I saw the outcomes, in many seminars, congresses, summits, whatever you like to call it, I've been explaining how good we were steering money to green investments. Until I saw this. A bit about myself. Let's start with benchmarking. Each and everybody working in the asset management environment should have a good connection with benchmarking. And for me personally, I grew up with an older brother. My brother was 10 years older, and there was a permanent competition between him and me, and he was my benchmark. He left house when he was 18 for university, and I was 8, so I never have beaten him in that period of time. Later on, I have beaten him, by the way. But having said that, benchmarks are relevant for us, are important for us, especially when they are, like we are a global investor. So when they are global, when there are peers, and when you can learn something from it. Then we go to this benchmark and the results. Um, I'm tempted to start a discussion on the methodology, on the outcomes. And I should have started to say, congratulations, Marc-André, CDPQ coming up number 1 in pension money investing, which made it again tempting to discuss the outcome. But having said that, we're not going to do that. Don't shoot the messenger, learn. And what we learn here, I have to, number 1, first really read the report and listen to it and see what's in it. And then, and you already touched upon that, Michael, the important thing is, what the heck can you do with a benchmark? And the important thing of a benchmark is, what are next steps for us? And again, I started from a position that I was convinced that APG Asset Management was in the top tier, in the Premier League of sustainable investors. And now I see this result. So I have a lot of explaining to do and a lot of learning. Sorry?
You've been relegated.
I'm a bit embarrassed, nearly ashamed to sit here, but also we should have, as financial sector, the resilience to say, okay, if this is the case, there's a lot of room for improvement. And that's an easy statement. So what are you going to do? Before I touch upon that, maybe it's good to
No, and that's really helpful. That's really good for bringing that up. And what's also interesting about this benchmark, we all know that carbon and carbon reduction in greenhouse gases is absolutely essential. It's the largest free-riding negative externality tied to our real economy. Bad stuff. But this is a bigger benchmark. This covers nature, covers the social, it covers a lot of things that aren't captured. But guess what? Those are also free-riding negative externalities that are not priced into the goods and services you buy, and how that translates into stocks and bonds that investors and banks either finance or own over time. And again, I'll briefly give you an example. We're all starting to see a price on carbon. Now imagine if you were buying stocks and bonds a few years from now, and by the way, you will be, and there's a price on carbon because the EU is doing a really great job, but it's going to be bigger and broader. So if one of your stocks and bonds, one of your companies has under the cost of goods sold a new expense line called carbon, and you have to deduct that with all the other expenses of your investments, all of a sudden the EBITDA, the free cash flow, and may I dare say, the valuation of absolutely everything you own, whether it's a PE or no matter how you evaluate it. So I would argue we're starting with carbon, but all the other stuff that's captured in this benchmark, which we haven't started putting a price on yet to mitigate in those investments, are coming down the line. As I said, legislation, regulation, it's coming. So imagine every single stock, every single bond, every piece of real estate is mispriced in your portfolio of every pension fund, bank, investor. It already is, I would argue, with carbon, but all these other things in this benchmark, it's coming your way. And this feeds me right into Liz, because you're in a philanthropic organization. You know, you care about this stuff. You help support this, and you care about things beyond just the obvious things. Tell us a little bit why you're here, why you're supporting this, and why this broad-based benchmark is important to you.
Okay, thank you. And Andrea, thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I'm with IKEA Foundation, and I have the great privilege of leading the work that we do on climate action. So with a team of grant makers, we look at what the Paris Agreement started in 2015, and it identified the what, but it didn't give us the how. And we understood from the very beginning that we needed to create an entire ecosystem of systemic change. So we have had the extraordinary privilege, quite honestly, of being able to think about what will be the movers and drivers for the real economy, non-state actors, for people in government, for everyday people, and create a portfolio of grants supporting brilliant groups like the World Benchmarking Alliance to provide the movement on that, whether it's data and analysis and transparency to keep things clear, accountable mechanisms. World Benchmarking Alliance, we have begun funding on agriculture, but we see this financial benchmark as incredibly important. And to the point that you raised earlier about financials, we also fund a project called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials for that very reason, because it will take an entire system of lift to move all parties engaged, all stakeholders, to see where we can benefit and create a better society in a low carbon way. And there are pain points with that, but there are also incredible innovations. One thing that I will say just from the outset, is that what Andrea presented to you looks incredibly ambitious, almost inhuman. How could you calculate all of that? And at IKEA Foundation, one of the things we enjoy doing is funding ambition with rigor and integrity. And if you bring those three elements together and you make it transparent and open source, as you do, that to us is the pathway towards success. So maybe that's a little bit of an introduction.
No, that's fantastic. And I must say, those other, what I would call less focused on elements that are captured in here, and your support of this is absolutely essential. Now, Marc-Andre, you look at, for the one person in this audience who doesn't know who you are, just tell them a little bit about you, what a great supporter you've been of green and sustainable finance over the years, and also give a little bit of context about why you're sitting here and why you care about this benchmark.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's interesting. So I'm Marc-André Blanchard, and I'm at CDPQ, and CDPQ is a Canadian pension fund based in the province of Quebec. And we're very happy to be here. It's interesting in life. It's interesting for me, and because I was at the UN when this idea, and Paulina and others were there for the launch of the World Benchmarking Alliance at the time, and I was at the launch event, and to see all of the work that the Benchmarking Alliance has done in such a few years, I just want to congratulate the entire team. And it was far from being obvious at the start exactly where it would go, what it would do, how it would be working, what kind of partnership there would be between, institutions and the alliance and everything. And so I just want to say kudos, because it's quite remarkable what has been achieved. Of course, I agree mostly with what Gert has been saying. It's interesting that APG and CDPQ are here, because we are very, very like-minded. From now on, we might be a little bit in a competition, but it's for the good of the world that we will continue to do this, because I'm sure APG will be one to be #1 next year, and make sure that they're not just #2 behind us, but #1. And that's the nature a little bit. But we've been, I must say, APG has been an inspiration.
We were going to be #1 next year.
Sorry?
We are going to be #1 next year.
I know that you'll be working.
I love it.
Hard,
We've got some genuine competition going here.
But that's why I was taking some notes. I wanted to make sure exactly where, what are the things we need to improve, because there's a lot of things we need to improve for next year, and we're going to be working on it in Montreal and in the world, in the 70 countries where we're present. But the idea for us of this benchmarking, what does it do to us? I think to me it's all about culture of our institutions. What needs to be done is the better alignment of capital with sustainable development. That's what, Michael, I've been working on since my UN days when I was the ambassador of Canada there. I was spending my really, because I was one of the few coming from the private sector, and for me that was I said, we had just agreed on the Paris Accord and on the SDGs, and if you just move a slight amount, a small percentage of the institutional investable capital in the world, you're going to make a huge difference. And this benchmarking is helpful with that. I agree with Gert. A lot of us think, we're bragging about what we do and all of that, and it's actually, we have to, in some ways, the results are not what they should be. It just shows how tough it is and how much work we need to be doing. On the other hand, for me, it's a question of culture within our institutions. At CDPQ, the first thing we did was align our compensation with our carbon footprint. And that was great, and it has had real impact. But now we really need to go one level deeper in the culture of our own people, our investors, but also of our portfolio companies. And then we need to invest, because it's all about, I agree with you, net zero. We've all made these commitments, but let's be honest, the plans to get there is not so clear, and it's uncharted territory for all of us. So what this benchmarking is doing, to me, it's actually helping us with all of the things we need to work on. And it reminds me of the UN. When I arrived at the UN, the number 2 told me, Marc-André, world peace and world stability is like a stool, 3 legs. It's actually development, governance, and security. And if you only work on one of the legs of the stool, you won't achieve stability in the world, or world peace, or sustainability. It's the same thing here. What you had on the screen that we all have to work on, and all of the aspects that we need to work on, to better align capital with sustainable development, this is essential. And to ensure the sustainability of our world, we all need to move on that. And we're all on a journey, and we all need to inspire each other. And this benchmarking will be helpful to that.
Now,
Could I add on that? Did you
Liz,
ask a
please,
question?
you've got a comment you want to make on that?
Yeah, no, just to build on what you're saying, you observe the little camaraderie and competition between these two, which I think is great, because it's the way that you get conversations started. But what's also important about the Benchmarking Alliance is you can talk about it from your individual perspective or the grand entire sector. And one of the faults that we often make in philanthropy and development is we talk about finance as a monolithic system. And when you hear Andrea describing, it is pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, it is asset managers, it is banks, it is insurers. I often have also made the mistake of likening it to the water that runs through the plumbing. We all want the hydration. We want to be able to water our gardens, feed ourselves, cook, use all the things from water, and we want it to flow together. But we need to see those individual droplets, because unless you are all acting at a systemically aligned way, we cannot scale the change that we need. And when you look at how low the participation is, you see and appreciate how much more of the finance sector we have got to engage on this problem. So
That's incredibly important observation, and I'm going to keep stoking this. I got the two of them kind of working it up. I kind of viewed them very differently, but now I think there's some overlap and a little bit of competition here. I'm dropping you from my portfolio. So what are the incentives? What role can you play? What incentives can be good for you two to make sure that all these people are going to have pensions when they get older? And me, like right now.
I'll go just one, and Gert, it's for me the future of what we're doing as institutional investor for that is, and Liz, I like your comment that we're part of the water, but we're all different. Like, and we need to come back to some of it. But for me, the game at CDPQ from now on is to engagement with our portfolio companies. And you have, I think it's our colleagues, I don't want to talk on their behalf, they're not there, but GIC, I think, in Singapore, for example, they have 100 engineers as part of their team, because they're working with their portfolio companies to actually help them and actually on the transition. And it's the same thing. So we have very strong targets to increase our percentage of assets of green assets, but we also have a $10 billion envelope for transition. And what we need to do for next year, it's part of my plan for my team next year, is to make sure that we get way better at, it's not a tick the box kind of ESG thing. We need to be able to say, okay, we're going to focus on maybe a subset of our portfolio company and see, okay, if we pull our resources together, the companies and us, here is something, a project that will put you further ahead in the transition, reduce your carbon footprint and the rest, and by the way, increase the value of your company. And I think that's where we need to be developing our skill set. But we have no engineer on staff at CDPQ. At the moment, we have a lot of big engineering companies that are portfolio companies. So maybe we'll partner with them. But we need to think, but this is thinking outside of the box a little bit. Just think about us. 10 years ago, we were buying bonds and buying stocks. And now we're thinking about actually contributing to the really deeply in the operations of our company. Way more than just having an operational partner and all of that.
Our host has got a question.
I love that you want to influence companies, and obviously that's a crucial part. That's where you amplify and scale on sustainability. I'm also interested in your role of influencing asset managers. I was listening to a debate earlier this morning with an insurance company and a big global asset manager, and the asset manager said we need asset owners to push us to offer the solutions and to create the product for them to the insurance company. I'm interested within the different players we've got in this benchmark, what you'll be looking at across the benchmark and how you could influence those as an asset owner.
Gert, you win this one, and we're going to go back to Marc-Andre because this is a really important question.
Absolutely. I'll circle back to your question, but first maybe on Andre and your question, Michael. The true story is I'm not that much busy with becoming number one next year, although that will be the outcome. That will be the outcome, but that's the... Thank you. Having said that, the true story is obviously steer our investments towards a better world. So I'm very happy where Marc-Andre explains that one of the instruments is aligning, incentivizing his team with carbon footprint. What we currently are doing is reformulating the targets, our targets with regard to carbon footprint, the SDGs. So our clients, the pension funds, give us even more sharper, ambitious, quantitative targets with regard to our investments. And that's also already one of the answers on your question. We are very much incentivized to steer our investments towards connection with SDGs, net zero carbon footprint. The challenges in the last few years, and it's often used as an excuse, which is not really the case, but is where's the data? I want to stay away from that discussion. We are developing platforms based on artificial intelligence to seek, based on public data, the relevant data and reporting abilities to explain that we're indeed moving to the right direction. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned in between something about rules and regulations coming up. At best, I have mixed feelings towards those rules and regulations coming up. And the reason for that is that I'm not convinced that in my view, massive amount of scattered rules and regulations globally, as there are standards are all helping us moving towards better investments. And that's why I'm happy with the... Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's why I'm happy with the World Benchmarking Alliance, because I hope we can grow to one very serious, trusted benchmark. That would be of great value for the financial sector.
And I think that's important. We've got another, go after this.
I want him to be able to get to Andrea's question, but I wanted to just make a quick comment on your question about pensions, because we have not yet mentioned people in this conversation. And the entire finance sector at the end of the pipe is about people, and pensions are the most exquisite example of that. I spent the first 15 years of my career focusing on the collapse of the Soviet Union, where people paid into the social contract their entire lifetime, only to see at the end of the road retiring without any dignity because their entire life savings were wiped away. And I don't want to be hyperbolic about this in terms of, but I want to honor why I think the benchmark is important. We can avert that kind of disaster for most other pension holders. And I'm not talking about those of you that are 20 or 30 or 40. I'm talking about me. Anyone over the age of 55 if we do not correct this, raise your hands in the room, if we don't correct this in terms of pensions, particularly in the financial system, we risk experiencing what many of our colleagues in the legacy countries from the Soviet Union also experienced. The inability to retire with dignity. So,
and I think that's important. So I wanted to build on what you've just said and Gert, and also bring in a bit of Marc Andres and then throw it over to you. So engagement. You've all heard about that, how you have to engage with your clients to be able to be able to transition. And what this benchmark talks about is not just the usual carbon, it's about also the social issues. Now, when you engage, you're basically a bad news bearer. You're telling your clients they've got to spend money to change their business model. That is not, I mean, engagement sounds like a nice word, and it's not a horrible, tough word, but it's a bad word if you're basically an investor in someone's stocks, bonds, or if you're the bank, and you say, you need to reduce your carbon, you need to get your social program in gear, and by the way, that takes a lot of thinking about things, a lot of money, a lot of capex potentially, and R&D. So you're the bad news bearers when you tell your clients that. Well, how do they react? Now, they probably say, fine, we'd love to do that, but, you know.
No, that's the issue. That's why we need to bring value to them. If we only bring check-the-box kind of discussion, that's the wrong one. Particularly when there's inflation, there's a war, and there's an energy crisis and a food crisis. Okay? So this is this is getting more difficult by the day. But that's why we need to be able to show result. It needs to impact their bottom line or their cost of financing or whatever in a positive or negative way, depending on the one you look at. But so this is to me the point of why I want to change the nature of the engagement with our portfolio companies. And the other part is on the question Andrea asked about, you know, where should we work? I mean, it's obvious that the planetary boundaries and the social conventions are the two. It seems from the results, I haven't analyzed in details, but like from what you said, that we need to work on. And I agree. When you look, I always said, when I was ambassador of Canada to the United Nations, we have $2 trillion that are in the hands of our pension funds in Canada, $2 trillion. This is a very important role. This is a very important responsibility for the Maple Lake. And the fact that, you know, when you look at it and a tiny fraction of 1% is invested in frontier markets, you're saying this is not sustainable. There's something wrong in that picture. On the other hand, we have a fiduciary obligation to our depositors and our pensioners. So this is where we need now to work. And this is why, for example, for me, when people talk to me about ESG and the S of ESG, well, I say this is the S to me is this is how we're going to invest. This is why blended finance is so important in that equation. We won't be able to measure the S the way we've been able to measure the E. I think we're dreaming in Technicolor if we think we're going to do that. But each of us, because we are different, because we have different stakeholders with communities and all of that, but we need to think very hard about, okay, what's our role in blended finance? What's our role? What do we want? What do we want to really try to help a little bit, or at least not make sure that we're not worsening the situation by our investment, and hopefully most of us will look at it in a positive way and say, okay, we're investing there because actually the partner is right, the returns are right, this is a great investment, but it's also helping to the housing, access to housing. It's also helping to whatever we care about. And this is new for institutional investors. And it's important that, I'll finish on that because I know you want me to cut, but I just want to say, institutional investors represent a third of the investable capital in the world. And what we're and we need to have a realignment of capital like we've never seen before in this world to achieve what we're talking about here in this COP and what we're talking in the SDGs. And I really believe in that. But the institutional capital needs to be part of the solution, so we need to move. But a lot of the problem is we need instruments. We need to engage with partners we've never engaged before.
Yep.
This is incredibly tough to do. And that's the challenge that we're facing.
I completely agree, and Liz is about to jump in on fiduciary.
Yeah.
But and that's a great thing. And I'm just going to pick up on something of Marc-Andre. Then I'm going to hand it over to you because fiduciary. What is a fiduciary interest, and is it short-term, long-term, immediate? That's that, and I think you're going there.
That's exactly
But
where
on
I'm
I agree with you on the social bit. It's a lot tougher to measure, but this benchmark picks up governance. And I think governance is a really great place to go to if you're trying to get a handle on the social and some of the other things, whether what the board is doing, the MI tied to what their initiatives are. You as an investor, you can't dig into everything, but you can get a view on how good the governance is on that. And I think the fact that this benchmark captures this is very important. And I mean, there's examples because the S and even the G remain somewhat obscure to people. And I'll give a very horrible example. We've all heard of Harvey Weinstein. He was a criminal. He's not just a problem around the sea, because there's pests and there's bullies in workplaces, but he was actually predatory. But the big deal is also the board knew about this and did nothing. And that's an S and a G thing, and it wiped out all the equity value in the most powerful and the most affluent company in Hollywood, an absolute mainstay. So we always talk about where the E's can get it. So you're absolutely right. The S's are tough, but there's ways, if you can keep an eye on the G, and this benchmark is looking at the G, is important. Now I'm going to hand back to Liz. Sorry for dominating, but the great thing about being the moderator, I get to do that. I'm going to hand it back to you to ask on the fiduciary, and then we're going to head back to Gert.
Yeah, never in my life did I imagine COP27 finance panel centering around Harvey Weinstein, but or even mentioning. But I wanted to come back to Marc-Andre's term, fiduciary duty, because it's something that everyone should care about and understand whether or not the concept of fiduciary duty in 2022 is the same as it was when it was originally created. Fiduciary duty, the way I understand it as a non-finance professional, is that you must, on balance, deliver to your stakeholders, investors, shareholders, etc., based on your exquisite and detailed and robust analysis of risk so that you return to them profit. The problem here is that we've never correctly priced and incorporated the climate risk into the conversation. Because if we price that risk, the investments that you are holding today would not look as though they're returning the same value. And one of the reasons why a benchmark becomes so important to the E, the S, and the G is that it gives us a different lens through which to ask those questions. Are we defining fiduciary duty the way we should in a world that is in ecological collapse and approaching a problem where we have not, and we only have 7 years left to reduce 49% of the warming potential that is resulting from many of the investments we currently hold. So,
Gert, you get first crack at this one.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first, moving on, thank you. Building on what Marc-Andre and what you just said on fiduciary duty. Number one, the fiduciary duty has for long been an excuse for pension money investors to say, oh no, that we can't do this or we can't do that. Now you see an interesting development which divides Northern Europe and North America, at least the United States. I'm not sure about Canada, by the way, but in the United States, fiduciary duty is still, by law, very much, maybe only solely focused on financial return. So there it goes, and short term. So that's your point. In Western Europe, and certainly in the Netherlands, you see that already also there is sufficient academic, legal evidence that the definition of fiduciary duty includes very much sustainable investing. So that I think that's an important point. Then the next step is, and that was also building on what Marc-André said, I think your observation is correct. And we all know there is tremendous lot of money necessary in short and long term to build a better world. And one of the interesting questions for me was, listening to Andrea and to the outcome of the benchmark, is this going to help us to move financial institutions to a better world? And the answer is, for me, after a very short reflection, the answer is yes. Obviously, there is a challenge to find more projects, as you already touched upon, and you can't do it from the situation we are in now. Maybe financial institutions are growing, as our Singaporean colleague GIC is, towards a more project developing institution. So growing from a pure financial investor towards a bit a strategic investor. But the steps we are making there are slow. So what we typically see is a journey towards far more public-private partnerships, public blended finance, if you like. And that will be the route forward. And that's why we are here. And the United Nations is an interesting platform, because there you see that we have first to build a layer of understanding each other. Governments, policymakers, investors, entrepreneurs, speaking the same language, building trust. And benchmarks like this can really build trust in saying, okay, this is very transparent in what you're doing. There's a lot to gain, but here do we stand. And it's not a perfect world.
That's brilliant. I'm going to hand over to our sponsor again. She's got some very insightful.
No, I just there's one point I want to clarify, and you've touched on so many points there that are important. We've used the language of ESG in this debate, and that's a framework that's used commonly in finance for numerous reasons. I want to make it really clear that this benchmark is greater than ESG. This is about mainstreaming sustainable finance, and I want to make that very clear to everyone on the panel and the people that are watching this. Because this is aspirational with where we're going. And there's a point that you touched on as well, Egert, about trust and transparency. Trust is very low at the moment. I've been on panels where we've had protesters bust into the room to make their point, and they have a voice and the frustration's high. So that need for transparency, to come back to the place of trust, to get the right people in the room to find the solutions that are needed, and I'd be interested in your views, because we measure this benchmark based on publicly disclosed information, and some of the pushback that we have had in places is the fact that they want to spend time on doing sustainable investing, not reporting on it. And there's the conundrum, but we need the transparency to rebuild trust and also to showcase what can be done. And I'm very interested in your views on that.
Shall I start? Well, thank you. Typically, one of the things we are doing, as Marc-André is mentioned, engaging with companies, his portfolio companies, he rightfully does, like we do. We also engage with the participants of the pension funds, which is as essential as with the portfolio companies, to understand whether or not they accept that we're moving their pension money towards sustainability, and they do, by the way. Recently, we installed, as another example, what we call, can have other names, we call it a reflection board. What is a reflection board? Our board of APGS management is talking with people from quite different backgrounds. For instance, from Greenpeace and from the Social and Cultural Planning Institute in the Netherlands, and from, well, very, very different backgrounds. And that is also incentivized by those results, because we increasingly understand that we have been living and investing in a financial bubble. We know CDPQ, we know GIC, we know a few others, but the true motives and desires of participants or NGOs are far away from us. So that's typically one example. There are more. Maybe let me explain one other thing on which we are pretty proud, but might be mainstream sustainability. For the first time, we invested together with 4 development banks in a fund financing projects, renewable energy in emerging markets. For the first time, we did that. 750 million euros, which is not a impressive money, but we're going to learn. And that's the way forward, and that's what I mentioned about blended finance. We are moving that way. Because it is too easy to say, in our world, the fiduciary duty, I'll end there, fiduciary duty is only focused on financial results, so the risk ends by a dotted line called investment grade. We're not going beyond the investment grade. And there are many solutions to be found in a public-private or blended finance environment, I think.
Now, what I think, I'm going to try and pull some of this together and then hand back over to Marc-Andre. But I think, taking what you just said, Gert, Liz, and Marc-Andre previously, is the way you do your investment analysis is going to change. Whether you're bringing engineers on, your typical equity analysts who just look at an IRR, and again, for the benefit of the folks here, whether you buy a stock or a bond, maybe it's one that makes my phone. The phone was made, obviously, using energy. Now, this may or may not have been incorporated into the price, but I guess with the cost of apples, it might have been. But also, it was probably packaged in some type of plastics. It was put around a million different places. And I guess what I'm saying is the true cost of this particular phone, if you were going to actually price it with all those negative externalities out, is going to be much more expensive. That means some of the stocks, bonds, investments that you have aren't going to be able to do that and get consumers to actually buy them. So you need different people on your team that can take a look at what, and I'm sure you all own reinsurance and insurance stocks and bonds. And them understanding, like the benchmark showed, the spatial and a lot of the other risks that are out there. I mean, climate risk, the pandemic, the cost to reinsurance and insurance on that, which are going to be big parts of portfolios, and doing analysis the way GIC is. And I would imagine they're just starting to do that. And being able to articulate the fiduciary responsibility you have is to actually start analyzing these stocks and these bonds with these negative externalities, whether they be social, whether they be environmental or governance, priced into the products and services. And if they're not doing it, you have to make some tough decisions. Is that a fair way of bringing that together?
Well, Michael, we already do my team did 600 analysis this year so far, and the year is not ended on what we call ESG. But for me, Andrea, ESG is there's a wide definition, and so I agree with you. And but it includes that. It includes, so it's just, and my goal next year is to go from 600 to 50, but do the 50 very in-depth one, because there are places where, the value added is not big, and because the information is so public and all of that, and we know. But there are places where actually you need to go deep, and you need to understand what are the real risks and what are the and so we do risk analysis, and on top of that we do the ESG analysis, which is a mix of what you could imagine between risk and geopolitics and technology and all of that. And and this is important, but to me, I want to do less but more in depth, but I also want to make sure, back to the cultural point, that actually it's ingrained in the culture of the investment teams that are on the first line, and actually thinking about those risks and those externalities and all of the issues that you've raised, and actually before they make a decision of going forward or not with an investment. And I think it's important. And it is I see with the people on our team at CDPQ, our investors actually thinking more and more broadly, and actually there's more and more investments that are cross asset class. There's more and more investments that are forcing us to actually think more in a matricial way than before, and where it was more the investment were clearer in one asset class only, and you needed to. It was easier or less, let's say, maybe less relevant to do that kind of analysis that you think.
Let me ask you. Go, please. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Gert.
well, maybe adding some example, because I recognize a lot of what Marc-André says, but indeed, talking about risk, I think 7 years, maybe even 5 years ago, we weren't thinking about climate risk in our analysis. And then we looked around in the room. Is there anybody who knows anything about climate risk 5, 7 years ago? No, nobody. So we hired a meteorologist, like somebody else might have hired an engineer. So that's partly an answer on your question. Yes, our teams are already changing and will be changing going on. And one other important development we have made, the journey we have made, is in the past decade. Obviously, maybe going back to my university, when you talked about investing, you talked about all kinds of return-oriented cash flow projections, whatever, and maybe a bit at risk. And then early this century, maybe cost came in.
Yeah.
And now we already, for quite some years, we talk about the diamond, in making investment decision. And the diamond are the four perspectives: return, risk, cost, and ESG, or sustainability if you like. And they all are embedded in our investment decision-making processes, like CDPQ, I guess, also does. So we already have made quite a journey, and it will go on. You're absolutely right.
Let me ask you another question, because you don't have to just influence the decision makers in the investments you make. You also, and you touched on this, Marc-André, you also have to influence the people who entrust money to you. Because ultimately, and for all of you in the audience, so I've got your money, I'm investing it for you right now. Actually, these two they know what they're doing. So they're going to offer you a superior return, let's say 8% today. It could be in any kind of investment, and most likely they're going to be in ones that are risky, because that's what they're offering you, because you want the highest possible return. Or these two say, but we can give you sustainable returns over a long time, but it may only end up being at 5 or 6%. Who goes for the 8% today? This is a really unfair thing. Hands up. Who goes for the 5 to 6% over the long term? All right, so you guys have some customers to fight over here, but I suspect this is a rigged audience. So
Michael, in practice, quite a lot of people still go for the short-term percentage, really.
And that's my question to you two. How do you have the discussion we just had right here with those that want the 8% today? Because their money's going to sit with you for a long time.
Yes, but that's not the way we do our asset allocation and everything. And the way we have 46 depositors that are either insurance plan of the government of Quebec or pensioners and all of that. And our return over the last 5 years have been north of 8%, and we think it's a sustainable return. And of course, this year will be slightly different, but it's the diversity of our portfolio and the diversity of the risk that we take that actually makes the recipe to actually maximize return in a sustainable way. So, but one thing is clear, is that our green assets have performed extremely well in the last 5 years, and we believe there's a correlation between actually investing in a sustainable way and having sustainable returns, and that is, and it's back, Andrea, to your comments about governance. It's the same thing. We see a link, a correlation between good governance and good returns, and of course there's a link between companies that think about the impact of climate change on their journey. There will be a clear link between that and returns.
And Gert, it sounds like you've got some 8%ers, so why don't you talk a little bit about that and what you can do with them?
Well, building on what Marc-André was saying, typically with the responsibility for a sound financial future of around 4.5 million Dutch citizens, you're not going to play the game of short-term, long-term, but you have a vast portfolio. And we have some... Yeah,
No.
well, that's my other issue is, I think that with that comes also the responsibility to tackle financial illiteracy. And asking your question, or trying your type of question, is a really an interesting one. But dear friends, 8% short term, let me say, if it sounds too good to be true, it mostly is too good to be true, certainly when it comes from Michael. So be aware, be aware. So I truly, I'm convinced that we have to work also on financial literacy. So explain to people. And yes, transparency comes with a lot of questions. And transparency comes with a lot of questions on the short term. And yes, indeed, 2022 will be an investment year where we have a lot to explain. But again, long-term investing, responsibility for so many participants in pension funds comes with a very disciplined approach and a lot of responsibilities. Agree.
Liz, I can see you're dying to get in here.
Well, I just want to ask both of you a question because it's so inspiring to hear you talk about the steps that you're taking. And I think about that financial literacy point, and we are influenced by what the media reports. And what we have seen is an increase in billionaires, a widening gap in equality, all sorts of things. What do you each feel your role is to work with media, and with the financial literacy questions and with the benchmark to help bring about more of the conscientious way that you're approaching your duties?
It comes back to what Gert said. You know, it's the trust question is very, very important in what we do. You know, this is I see this responsibility that we have towards the citizens of Quebec as very not only important, but it's a very grave and like serious one. And you should see the reason why I work at CDPQ and I chose to go to CDPQ is that the purpose is that purpose is animating. Really, it sounds some may say, well, it's too much. It's motherhood and apple pie what he's saying. But what differentiates us at CDPQ in the North American context, in Canada and in Quebec and Montreal as an employer is the purpose. People come to us because they think that there's a higher purpose there, and it's actually this is why I know that the results are. We all have work to do, but that our 1,500 employees will be very inspired to actually have come on top of this benchmarking analysis because they recognize we're not perfect. There's a lot of room, and we're on a journey. But the fact that when we compare to the world, we're actually a thought leader, and it's important for our people. And it's important to be a thought leader, deploying constructive capital, and having the right returns that we need for our depositors. And yes, of course, we live in a world that the inequalities and everything that you've raised, we live every day under the scrutiny of the media in Canada and Montreal. But that's what, at the end of the day, it's about doing our work in a very responsible way with the best talent and the best, the most reasonable approach to investment, because we have a dual mandate, and that has given us in our gene, we have the mandate of return to depositors, but contribution to the economic development of Quebec. That has given us in our genes, in our genesis, actually it has added to the purpose of saying our role is make sure depositors, pensioners have money when they retire, but also make sure that we think about stakeholders. We think about our communities. And you know what? That's why on the climate side, we were amongst the first to come out with a climate strategy. It was because of that. For us, it was, it was a natural thing to do because, And the dialogue on this with our depositors is very important. We have 46 different depositors, and they have 46 boards and specific governance and stuff. We go very deeply in our engagement with our depositors about the risk we're taking, the diversification, the allocation of our assets, and also the issues around what we're around sustainability, around ESG, about what it means to deploy constructive capital.
That's incredible. I'm sure. There we go. Now, look, you've heard us go through why we think this benchmark is not just another report. You've seen two investors who are living, breathing examples of how they're trying to think about it. We've got a few minutes before we go. I'm going to hand over. Does anyone here have a question you'd like to ask, either specifically about the benchmark or how it might basically be important to either the investor, the investment community, or even more importantly, for those in the philanthropic community that are supporting these type of things? I open the floor to anyone that does have a question. Aha, I see two. This young lady first, young lady second, young man third. Sorry, I'm really old, so I'm going to come over and hand you the microphone. Please let us know who you are.
So thanks to the panelists first for the very inspiring and informative session. So my name is Alessandra. I work for Blue Orchard, which is an impact asset manager. And actually my question is not about the benchmark itself, but it's more about the asset allocation, right? Because it has been very relevant to hear the type of conversation you have with your investors, but from our perspective, sometimes it's very complicated to crowd in pension funds in our projects because you can only come in with large tickets. And some of these impact finance projects, they are small by definition, right? So we're not in a position sometimes to absorb your contribution. So it's to get your view on how we can manage to get you in our blended finance structure. You mentioned blended finance, so I want to hear from you how you think we could try to work together also on smaller scale, on small projects. Thanks.
That's a great question. How can smaller green investments maybe get aggregated to get you guys involved in it?
Go ahead.
I'll hand it over.
I'll follow
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question, because indeed, large institutional investors like CDPQ and APG come out of an era where we used to focus on large tickets, standardize enormous sum of money. I think we both nearly $500 billion whatever around. So we have to standardize, to have two processes from a cost perspective. But there are at least 4 reasons to also have what we call core satellite model, where you have the core large investment vehicle and some satellites. And currently we have, for instance, a small fund focusing on energy transition in the Netherlands, writing tickets somewhere between 5 and 50 million euros, which is in our terms small. We have a similar fund on biotechnology health, and the first reason obviously is to have impact. The second one is to have a sound return, and impact in the sense that you build up expertise. The third reason, building up expertise. I think a handful of years ago we didn't understand anything about the markets around hydrogen, for instance, let alone green hydrogen. So you build up your expertise, and the fourth reason is that if things go well, and in life sometimes things go well, you need a next step and the next financing round, and it becomes a large potential investment. So it's also a feeder fund. So my story is, yes, we come from an era where we only did big tickets. We're moving towards having a core satellite model where we can be far more thematic for good reasons.
And that is not, what Gerd said is not uncommon amongst our peers, where that's a common thing. I mean, GIC, for example, is in that direction. And we are, to a certain extent, I'll just give you one example. I'm so proud of that example at the moment, that what we're trying to do, because it's not done. But it's It's this, I think I've mentioned briefly, but it's a platform for adaptation infrastructure in low-income and lower-middle-income countries. It's very tough to finance that. And the risks are very high in some areas and the likes. You know, financing a seawall is a difficult thing. So we needed to, but our fixed income, our credit team came up with this idea. It's not me, it came from our investors who said we ought to be able to find a way to go in some markets where we've not gone before, get the return that we need for the risk we're taking, but do it in a way that is reasonable with the risks that we can take. And so they've developed this platform of debt for projects that are from 5 to 75 millions in 25 countries. And the way they do, so we're going to do it through a platforms, and we're doing it with MUFG, and we're going to, we hope to do it with partners, with multilateral partners and family offices and insurance companies. It takes a village to do this. I mean, this morning I was at a working session. There were 30 people around the table representing almost 20 institutions that are part of the ecosystem to make it happen. And this is finding the right risk-return equation where we as institutional investors can go with respect to our fiduciary obligation, recognizing that we need to be part of the solution. And if we make that work, the trust that is, I've seen dramatically over the last 5-6 years that I've been touched, or 7 years now that I've been involved in the multilateral world. This is my 3rd or 4th COP. I find that the trust issue, there's a gap that is growing, north, south, private sector, governments, private sector, civil society, governance, civil society. And we need, why? Because we've not been able to achieve results so far. A lot of promises have been made, a lot of engagement have been made, but the results are not felt. And now that's why blended finance is so important and it's so crucial, because that's a way to have an impact and have results on the ground. But we need, at the time when there's, populism, like that's going to look, if governments get involved to de-risk us, it's going to look like a subsidy to the private sector. But then, as you said, there's many different players in the private sector. We are, like I keep telling.
Okay.
No, but that's very important. But the last point I'll make is, for example, I tell the government of Quebec, government of Canada, like our pension funds in Canada, this is the money of Canadians. So so like it's different source of capital than other source of capital.
He's going to write your next ticket. So we've got only about 5 minutes left. So if the two questionnaires can actually make their questions very succinct, one after another, and then if the panelists can nail them tight and we can get this right in on time. So perfect. I love it. Right next to each other. Please introduce yourself, ask a succinct question, and we're going to try and knock through both of them in the next 7 minutes. Please.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Karen Ellis from WWF. Great to see the benchmark coming out. Congratulations. It's really good to see this increased transparency. Also great to hear 2 companies who are really engaging with it and trying to increase their scores and competing to do so. But my question is, surely you are the good guys. You're really trying hard, but there's plenty of companies out there, financial institutions, who are not trying very hard, who don't care where they come on the benchmark. Sorry, are you unable to hear me? Okay. So, and surely you need regulation to force the laggards to also work to deliver some of these improvements. Because otherwise you'll be undercut in the way that Michael was setting out, because they won't have to pay to do those extra things. So surely you need that regulation, especially on sort of environmental issues which have definite externalities to be addressed. I'll pass it over. Thank you.
This is Anton of TNO. Most climate data is based on estimates that have uncertainties, sometimes large ones. Scientists around the world are working hard to make more measurements about the climate to reduce those uncertainties. Can the panel comment on the value of using more measurement data in your benchmarks and your statistics that you use to basically make huge financial decisions? Secondly, Is there a way in which the world of finance and the world of science can work together on this? Because they're usually quite separated, and I think that's a pity, especially because scientists are hugely underfunded in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two great questions. One about science and the benchmark we're going to hand off to our host, and also another one about regulation and its role in here.
I'm going to answer both of those quickly, and I'm happy to discuss them afterwards. The point of regulation, if I can answer that anecdotally, what we found in doing this benchmark is typically those companies that are outliers or that are leading the way. I'm going to put words in some mouths here, but generally, though they finance system welcomes regulation because they want a level playing field. That's a sweeping generalization. What they want is one standard, they want alignment, and they want consensus, and regulation should give that. I'd also think it's worth mentioning that World Benchmarking Alliance, we are the beauty of this benchmark and what we do is that as where we sit in the system, we do feed our results and our information into policymakers. So when decisions are being made, we do try very hard to make sure that they're making informed decisions from the regulation, because what we need is good and effective regulation and the right regulation in the right places, not regulation that ends up having unintended consequences. The point about science, and I think I'm not a technician, so there are others better qualified to answer this than me. This is a broad index, and I think where we've got science and where we have that, then absolutely we must use it. But I think in some of the hard-to-reach areas, you hear people talk, especially in emerging markets, talking about it's more of an art than a science, and I argue that it's science where we have it, but there is an element of art, because if we drive it down to a number in certain places, you'll cut off funding where it's needed most, and where perhaps more judgment and experience is needed. That's my short answer, but I'm welcome to discuss it afterwards.
And I'll hand off to the panel now, regulation in science. Please, Gert.
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the relatively easy question. In the world of asset managers, data is essential. We love it. So the better, the more details, great. And that's partly answering your question. But more intriguing is how can we bridge, if there's a gap, the worlds of academics and asset managers. What we do, we have a tradition, APG has a tradition of working closely with universities. So we sponsor, by the way, I think 3 professors in different Dutch universities, as an example, have a tight relationship with their universities, sponsor research, and that's for us the way to get access to, for us, relevant research. So there is you might say, I don't like the word, but let's use it, ecosystem of academic research, even globally, I think, but certainly in Western Europe, with the asset management world, at least the institutional investors. And then maybe you want to tap in, but that is typically something what we embrace. Then I earlier touched upon rules and regulations. And when I focus on Europe, the European Union, they're coming up with a lot of rules and regulations. And my mixed feelings are based on the given that, on the one hand, I must say, the financial sector needs clear rules and regulations. Just a quick step aside. If you look at the past 2 decades and what financial institutions has been doing, we clearly need rules and regulations, no doubt about that. But if I look at SFDR, for instance, SFDR Article 9, 8, 6, that's pretty challenging. And if I look at the upcoming regulation directive, SSDDD, my God, I'm asked to do something which I only can today, what I only can do in 2-3 years' time. So there are my mixed feelings. We're making it complex. I'm not always convinced that the incentives of rules and regulations are not pushing some parties to greenwashing instead of the right direction. Let me end here.
Great. Liz and Marc-Andre, if you can weigh in.
Really quickly on, is this working? Yeah. Oh, on regulation, I agree very strongly with Andrea on this. If we want the good deeds of companies that are at the top of the benchmark to really survive against the wave of the others that are not good players, you automatically want to say, well, regulate, but that might not necessarily be the most nuanced instrument all the time. It can be very, very blunt. The importance of data transparency to make better, more informed decisions on the correct regulation and where it can have its greatest impact is of incredible value, because just adding more regulations will not solve the problem. On science, to me, it depends on the unit of analysis. When we deal with something like science-based targets at the company level, where the company must take action in the real economy to measure its own footprint and then work according to science, you get that unit of analysis on scope 1, 2, and 3 that becomes incredibly important. Otherwise, it can also be a blunt instrument, although things like satellite data, and I see one colleague in the back of the room that has done tremendous work on this with methane leaks and emissions, that becomes an incredible tool that I think would benefit so many asset managers and investors. So let me pass on to my other colleague.
No, I know we're out of time, so the answers were complete on these two topics, so I'll...
Well, look, you've been a wonderful audience. We've gone for an hour and a half on how important we believe and impactful and useful this immensely, I think, important benchmark is. You saw in from the real players, the people who are actually investing the money, how they think they are going to use it and apply it. Could you please give me a large round of applause for our wonderful panel here? And thank you very much, everyone. And I betcha you could probably grab them right now for an investment. Take care. Thank you. Bye now.